Charlie had always dreamed of visiting London, and more specifically of seeing the Royal Guards in person. For as long as he could remember, his family had heard him talk about them, the tall, stoic figures who stood proudly at Buckingham Palace. In fact, it wasn't just a casual dream for Charlie, it was a goal. Charlie had special needs, and this was something that made some experiences more difficult for him, but it also gave him a certain resilience. He faced challenges that most other kids didn't, but this didn't stop him from dreaming big. And his big dream was to stand in front of those royal guards, to see the horses and maybe even touch the reins. Charlie's parents had noticed his fascination with the royal guards for years. Every time they passed by a picture of one of the guards in a book, or when Charlie watched a video of the changing of the guard ceremony online, his face would light up with excitement. He would talk about them for hours, imagining what it would be like to stand just a few feet away from them, watching as they stood perfectly still, with their stiff uniforms and fierce horses. He would even try to mimic their posture, standing still in his room like a soldier, dreaming of one day being part of the ceremony. For Charlie, the idea of the guards wasn't just about watching them. It represented something much deeper, his desire to be part of something grand, something that seemed out of reach. His world, shaped by his special needs, was often filled with misunderstandings, moments of confusion, and feelings of being different from other kids his age. But the guards, with their unwavering discipline and unchanging roles, seemed to Charlie like the perfect example of strength, focus, and importance. Charlie's family understood his connection to the guards. His parents had always been incredibly supportive, looking for ways to help Charlie reach his goals, no matter how big or small. So when they began planning their trip to London, there was no doubt that seeing the Royal Guards would be one of the highlights of their visit. It wasn't just another tourist attraction. It was a chance to make one of Charlie's biggest dreams come true. The journey to London wasn't easy. For most families, traveling with a child with special needs can bring added challenges. For Charlie, the long flight, the noise of the airport, and the crowded streets of the city could be overwhelming. But his parents had prepared him for this, explaining everything along the way. They told him that they were going to see the Royal Guards at Buckingham Palace, and Charlie's excitement grew with each passing day. He had seen pictures of the palace before, but now he was going to see it in person and maybe even get close enough to the guards to wave at them. As they arrived in London, the family made their way through the busy streets toward Buckingham Palace. Charlie's heart was racing with excitement, and his parents tried to keep him calm, explaining that it was a special moment, and they would need to wait in line with the other visitors. But for Charlie, the waiting was just part of the adventure. He didn't mind the long lines or the crowds. In fact, he found them exciting, because they meant that he was getting closer to his goal. He didn't quite understand why the guards stood still, but he knew that this was something special, something that would be remembered for a long time. Finally, after what seemed like hours of anticipation, they arrived at Buckingham Palace. The grand gates stood before them, and the sight of the palace took Charlie's breath away. It was even more magnificent than he had imagined. The guards, in their bright red uniforms and tall black hats, stood perfectly still, just as Charlie had seen in the pictures. The horses, equally majestic, waited alongside their riders, creating a scene of extraordinary beauty. Charlie could hardly believe he was seeing it all up close. It was everything he had dreamed of, and more. But as they walked closer to the guards, Charlie's parents began to worry. Charlie, who was used to showing his excitement in ways that might be hard for other people to understand, could easily get overwhelmed in such a formal setting. He might start jumping up and down or making sounds that others might find unusual. His parents had seen it happen before, and they feared that his excitement might make the situation awkward, especially with so many tourists around. Would the guards look at Charlie and think he was being disruptive? Would they be annoyed? Charlie, however, wasn't thinking about any of that. He was lost in the magic of the moment. The closer he got to the guards, the more his heart raced. He had read about them in books and watched videos, but this was real. He could see the horses up close, their eyes gentle and calm, their coats gleaming in the sunlight. The guards, even though they didn't smile or speak, were still a part of something bigger than Charlie had ever imagined. And for a moment, as he stood there, just a few feet away from them, He felt as if he was part of something grand. As Charlie and his family stood on the side, taking in the scene, they could hear the chatter of other visitors around them. Some people were snapping pictures, others were pointing out the details of the ceremony. But for Charlie, it wasn't about the pictures or the ceremony. It was about the experience of being there, right in the heart of history. His parents smiled, watching as Charlie's eyes shone with wonder. They had hoped that this day would be special, but seeing their son so happy made it even more meaningful. They could tell that Charlie was having the time of his life, lost in the awe of the moment. Still, they couldn't help but feel a little anxious, wondering how he would behave when the time came for him to be close to the guards. They had prepared Charlie for this moment. They had talked about the importance of being respectful, of not disturbing the guards or the horses. Charlie understood, but at the same time, his excitement was hard to contain. He had been dreaming of this day for so long that it was nearly impossible for him to stay still. As they watched, Charlie took a step forward, his eyes still glued to the guards. His parents held their breath, hoping that everything would go smoothly. And then, something unexpected happened. As Charlie stood there, feeling like the luckiest boy in the world, he didn't realize that this moment would soon be more than just a dream come true. It would become an unforgettable experience for everyone involved. Charlie's connection to the Royal Guards, which had been building in his heart for years, was about to unfold in a way that no one could have predicted. The Royal Guards of Buckingham Palace were an iconic symbol of British tradition. For centuries, they had stood at the gates, ever watchful, ever stoic. To the thousands of visitors who came to see them each year, these guards were figures of awe and fascination. Their sharp red uniforms, the towering black hats that seemed almost comically large, and their perfectly groomed horses made them seem like living statues, frozen in time. For many tourists, seeing the Royal Guards was one of the highlights of their trip. They would take photos trying to catch the perfect moment of the guard standing at attention, or perhaps a horse turning its head just the right way. The guards rarely moved, and when they did, it was only for ceremonial purposes as part of the changing of the guard, an event that had become a symbol of British tradition and pride. The guard's role was clear: to maintain a perfect image of discipline and strength. They didn't smile, they didn't speak, and they didn't engage with anyone. Their job was to remain silent and still, providing a sense of order in a world that could often feel chaotic. For the guards, this wasn't just a job. It was a lifelong commitment to upholding a tradition that had lasted for centuries. Each one of them had undergone intense training, learning how to stand still for long hours no matter the weather or the distractions around them. Their ability to maintain focus and composure was what made them legendary. Their horses, too, were part of the tradition. These majestic animals were just as disciplined as their riders, moving with the grace and precision that had been trained into them over many years. The bond between a guard and their horse was strong, a relationship built on trust and mutual respect. In some ways, the guards and their horses were like partners in this great performance, working together to maintain the dignified atmosphere that Buckingham Palace had come to represent. As tourists lined up in front of the palace gates, they couldn't help but stare in amazement at the guards. It was a spectacle like no other. But the reality of standing in front of these stoic figures was something different entirely. For one thing, the guards weren't there to entertain or engage with visitors. They didn't move unless they were commanded to, and they didn't show any signs of recognition, no matter how many people waved or shouted at them. They were simply there to stand and protect the palace. And for most people, this silence and stillness were part of what made the guards so fascinating. It was almost as if they were above the hustle and bustle of the world around them, standing in a place where time seemed to slow down. In a way, the guards became living symbols of tradition and duty. They reminded people that some things, like history and honor, were worth preserving and protecting. But as Charlie's family watched the guards from a distance, they could feel the tension in the air. The stillness, the formality, and the unyielding discipline of the guards were intimidating to most visitors. It was clear that these figures, no matter how impressive, were not there to interact. They were untouchable, silent sentinels who seemed immune to anything outside their duty. And this was exactly why Charlie's family had been worried. The whole point of visiting Buckingham Palace was to give Charlie the chance to experience something he had dreamed about for so long. but his special needs often meant that he acted in ways that might not be understood by others, especially in such a formal setting. Would the guards notice if Charlie became too excited? Would they see his gestures or hear his sounds and find them distracting? It was a concern that lingered in the back of their minds as they waited. They knew that Charlie could get overstimulated by crowds or loud noises, and they feared that the high level of formality at Buckingham Palace might make him feel uneasy. Would he be able to enjoy the experience without feeling out of place? For now, Charlie didn't seem to care about the formalities. He was too busy taking in every little detail of the scene around him. The horses, with their strong and graceful movements, caught his attention first. He marveled at how the guards sat so perfectly on their horses, their posture unshaken. The horses seemed just as still as their riders, their heads held high, their muscles taut and ready. Charlie watched the horses closely, fascinated by their every movement. As they stood there, Charlie's family watched him closely, knowing that soon they would be able to get closer to the guards. But even as they prepared to move forward, they couldn't shake the feeling of nervousness. The guards were so serious, so poised in their role, that the thought of approaching them with a child who might not be able to control his excitement was daunting. But despite their worries, they also knew how much this moment meant to Charlie. They could see the sparkle in his eyes, and it made everything else seem insignificant. Part 3. Charlie's moment of interaction. The unexpected. The moment Charlie had been waiting for had finally arrived. After a few more minutes of watching the royal guards, his family decided it was time to step forward and get closer. Charlie, full of excitement, bounced slightly on his feet, his eyes fixed on the guards and the horses. His heart was racing, and the world around him seemed to disappear as he focused solely on the figures before him. He had dreamed of this moment for so long, and now that he was finally here, it felt like everything else faded away. As they walked closer, Charlie's enthusiasm became more evident. He was almost vibrating with excitement, his hands moving in the air, trying to mimic the guard's stiff posture. His parents, walking beside him, exchanged nervous glances. They were proud of how well he had managed so far, but they knew that his excitement could sometimes cause him to act in ways that might be hard to understand. His gestures were bigger than normal, his voice louder than usual. To the people around them, Charlie might have seemed out of place in the stiff, formal setting, but to his parents it was just another way of showing his joy. Charlie was so overwhelmed by the presence of the guards that he didn't notice how close he was getting to one of them. His focus was entirely on the horses and the uniformed men standing before him, but his parents noticed the guard's shift in posture, a small change that signaled something unusual. One of the guards, who had been standing perfectly still, looked directly at Charlie. The boy was too lost in the moment to notice, but the guard's eyes softened as he looked at the child. There, in the midst of all the tourists, the guard's face seemed to change, just a little, as if he recognized something in Charlie's excitement. It was subtle, but it was there, a moment of humanity breaking through the stern mask of the royal guard. Then, as if to acknowledge Charlie's joy and his unique way of expressing it, the guard did something that no one had expected. He took a small step forward, closer to the child. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, but it was significant. The guard then gently turned his horse so that it faced Charlie, bringing the majestic animal even closer. Charlie, still oblivious to everything except his fascination with the horses, looked up in awe. His parents were speechless, watching as the guard silently allowed Charlie to come closer to the horse. They had worried about Charlie's behavior, wondering how the guards would react, but instead of turning him away or scolding him, the guard had extended a silent, kind gesture. The horse, too, seemed to respond to the change in atmosphere, lowering its head slightly as if acknowledging Charlie's presence. It was a small act, but to Charlie it was everything. Charlie's face lit up as he slowly reached out toward the horse's reins. His parents, who had been holding their breath, now smiled softly, feeling the weight of the moment. The crowd around them seemed to quiet, perhaps recognizing the magic of what was unfolding. Charlie, with his pure, innocent joy, had sparked a moment of kindness from the royal guard. It wasn't the usual behavior expected from these stoic figures, but it was something much more meaningful. It was a simple act of kindness, an acknowledgement that, despite the formality and the rules, there was room for a little humanity in the middle of tradition. For Charlie, this moment was more than he had ever hoped for. The royal guard, still standing tall and proud, had broken character just for him. And in that moment, Charlie felt seen, valued, and understood in a way he hadn't expected. His dream had come true, not just because he was standing in front of the royal guards, but because the guards, in their quiet way, had reached out to him, offering a moment of connection that transcended the boundaries of formality. As Charlie stood there, caught in the whirlwind of his excitement, he could barely contain himself. His parents watched him closely, knowing that this was the moment he had been dreaming of for so long. The royal guards, with their perfect stillness and imposing figures, were right in front of him. And for Charlie, this was more than just a visit to Buckingham Palace. It was a moment of true magic. The sight of the guards and their horses was everything he had imagined and more. But it wasn't just the horses or the uniforms that fascinated Charlie. It was the very presence of these figures, who seemed so much larger than life. They were symbols of something beyond just the palace or the ceremony. They represented strength, tradition, and order, and for a child like Charlie, who faced so many challenges, they were a sign that there was still room in the world for something steadfast and unchanging. But as he got closer, something unexpected happened. Charlie, caught up in the excitement, forgot to follow the usual rules of politeness and formal behavior that everyone else seemed to follow. He started jumping a little, his hands waving in the air, a big grin on his face as he took in every little detail of the guards and their horses. It wasn't unusual for Charlie to express his emotions in this way. His excitement had always come out in big gestures and movements, which could sometimes be difficult for others to understand. He didn't always know how to tone it down, especially when something was as thrilling as this. Charlie's parents, though proud of how happy their son was, began to worry. Would the guards, who were known for their disciplined and silent demeanor, get annoyed? Would they turn away, disapproving of Charlie's exuberance? They knew how much Charlie had dreamed of this moment, and they were doing everything they could to keep him calm. But they also didn't want to disrupt the sacred atmosphere of Buckingham Palace. They had been preparing Charlie for this moment for weeks, telling him about how important it was to show respect to the guards, to stay quiet, and to not get too close. But here, in the presence of these larger-than-life figures, it was hard for Charlie to contain his joy. As they slowly made their way forward, Charlie's enthusiasm only grew. He was so focused on the guards and the horses that he didn't notice how close he was getting. The guards stood perfectly still, their eyes trained forward, their posture never wavering. But as Charlie moved closer, one of the guards, who had been standing at attention, began to notice the child's excitement. Instead of the usual cold, unchanging stare that everyone had come to expect from the royal guards, this particular guard's eyes softened slightly. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Charlie's parents to notice. For a brief moment, the stillness of the scene was broken. The guard, who had been part of the living tradition for so long, took a small step forward, bringing himself closer to Charlie. The other tourists around them didn't seem to notice, caught up in their own conversations or busy taking pictures. But for Charlie and his parents, this simple act felt like the entire world had shifted. The guard didn't smile, he didn't speak, but there was something unmistakable in his gesture, a subtle acknowledgement of Charlie's presence. It was a silent offering of kindness, a small crack in the strict discipline that governed the guard's behavior. Charlie's parents were stunned. They had expected the guard to remain stoic, to ignore them and their son as he had done with the other visitors. But instead, the guard had made a decision, whether consciously or not, to interact with Charlie in a way that no one could have predicted. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a simple shift of his position, but it meant everything to Charlie. His excitement bubbled over, and without thinking, he stepped forward, his eyes locked on the guard's horse. The animal's gentle eyes seemed to meet Charlie's, as if acknowledging him in return. The horse shifted slightly, lowering its head a little, allowing Charlie to get closer. For a moment, Charlie froze. His heart raced, and his hands, still twitching with excitement, slowly reached out toward the reins of the horse. The crowd around them seemed to quiet as they noticed the small exchange unfolding. This wasn't just a tourist attraction anymore, it was a moment of pure connection. The guard's action, though subtle, had transformed the scene into something far more personal for Charlie. In that brief instant, the barrier between the royal figure and the child with special needs had melted away. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about a shared understanding that transcended all the formalities. As Charlie gently touched the reins, he looked up at the guard, his eyes wide with wonder. His parents, too, stood in awe, unable to fully comprehend the significance of what had just happened. They had feared that their son's excitement would cause a disturbance, but instead, it had created a moment of kindness that they would remember forever. The guard, still standing tall and composed, had broken the usual barriers of formality to connect with a child who might have otherwise been overlooked. And Charlie, in his innocence, had unknowingly bridged that gap with his pure joy and enthusiasm. For Charlie, this was a dream come true, but it was more than just a dream. It was a lesson in how the world could be full of unexpected moments of kindness and understanding. His excitement had never been about breaking rules or causing a scene. It was simply about experiencing the world in a way that felt true to him. And in that moment, the Royal Guard had seen that and responded with empathy. Charlie's parents, overwhelmed with gratitude, smiled at each other. They realized that this experience had turned out to be so much more than they had ever expected. They had hoped for a special day for Charlie, but they had not anticipated how much this moment would touch their hearts. The other tourists around them, who had been snapping photos or chatting amongst themselves, began to take notice of what had happened. Some of them smiled, seeing the kindness in the interaction. Others seemed to pause for a moment, recognizing the significance of the small, unexpected act of compassion. The guard, though he hadn't broken his composure or his role, had shown a kind of humanity that few would have ever thought possible from someone in his position. Charlie, meanwhile, was oblivious to the effect his moment with the guard had on everyone around him. His focus remained on the horse, which had now stepped even closer to him, allowing him to get a better look. He could hardly believe that this was happening, that the horse was right there in front of him, so close that he could touch it. His hands gently brushed against the reins, and for a moment everything seemed perfect. He had dreamed of this day for so long, and now it was more than he had ever imagined. Not only was he seeing the guards and the horses up close, but he was being allowed to engage with them in a way that felt so personal and meaningful. As they stood there, Charlie's parents watched him in wonder. They had feared this day would be difficult, worried that Charlie's behavior would be misunderstood or even make others uncomfortable. But now, they could see that their son had experienced something truly special. The Royal Guard's kindness had turned a simple visit into an unforgettable moment for their family. It wasn't just the setting, the horses or the guards that made the day remarkable. It was the unspoken connection that had occurred between Charlie and the guard, a moment of shared humanity that would stay with them forever. For Charlie, this moment was more than just a story to tell his friends. It was a reminder that kindness in its purest form could be found in even the most unlikely places. And for his parents, it was a lesson in how openness and understanding could turn a dream into something even more meaningful than they had ever imagined. They had come to Buckingham Palace with hopes of making a memory for Charlie. But what they had left with was a memory that would stay with them all for a lifetime. This version expands on the emotional exchange between Charlie, his family, and the Royal Guard. It builds the tension of the moment, showing Charlie's excitement and his family's anxieties, before describing the unexpected kindness of the guard, creating a heartwarming moment that transcends formality and connects the two worlds.